stone and roots in it that you have to deal with. And then some of your landscape dealers, they'll have what's called a garden soil. And what this is regular topsoil that's already mixed with organic matter. So it's kind of a ready to go garden mix. And that's a good source for buying for your raised beds, or if you need to amend your own soil in an in-ground garden. Once you have the soil, what you want to do is lime and fertilize it. But before you do that, you need to get a soil test. And soil tests reveal if and how much lime and fertilizer is needed. Most vegetables, excuse me, the soil test will indicate the pH of your soil, and it's the basis for your liming recommendations. And most vegetables grow well in the slightly acidic soil, the pH of about 6 to 6.5. And this is the pH range which the soil nutrients are most available for your vegetables. To take a soil sample, what you want is a clean trowel and a clean bucket to make sure you don't contaminate it with any residual lime or fertilizer. And then you want to take 8 to 10 samples randomly throughout the garden. You see the red dots down here on the map, and that illustrates the zigzagging process of taking your soil sample. Then you want to get a soil sample in the top left corner here of about 6 inches. You want to take it from the top of the soil down to the bottom, about 6 inches, and that's the root zone for most of your vegetables. You take these subsamples and you place it in the bucket, mix the samples thoroughly together, and then you fill a plastic sandwich bag about 3/4 full and bring that to the extension office. And the cost is $9. And then in about 7 to 10 working days, you'll get your results back. And if you give us your email address, then we get that results back to you more quickly. And what you'll get is the soil test report. And the report has 2 sections to it. The top section is a graph, and this graph gives you the condition of your soil. It tells you how much phosphorus you have, zinc, calcium, and so on and so forth. But the important thing up here, it also tells you how much pH you have. Down here, you can see this circle right here. Your pH on this particular sample was 5.5. And then, but what you want to concern yourself with is this recommendation section. And that's going to tell you how much lime you need to put on your garden to bring it up to the 6 to 6.5 range. And in this particular soil sample, you need 105 pounds of lime per 1,000 square feet. If you do need to put lime on your garden, we recommend that you put down dolomitic limestone. It has magnesium in it, and the Georgia soils are deficient in magnesium, so use a dolomitic limestone. Second recommendation is your fertilizer recommendation. And one of the standard recommendations is sulfur. You'll see here it's a 1/2 pound of sulfur or 2 pounds of gypsum per 1,000 square feet. And that's pretty much standard for your vegetable gardens. Then it breaks down how much fertilizer you need to put for your vegetables. And it's broken down into 2 categories. One is the medium feeders, which you see right here. And that's most of your crops are medium feeders. Your beans, cantaloupes, tomatoes, peppers, things of that nature are your medium feeders. On this soil, you need 30 pounds of 10-10-10 per 1,000 square feet. That also tells you, if you just want to fertilize the row, how much you need per 100 feet of row space. Then you also have some heavy feeders like broccoli and cabbage, things of that nature, that require more fertilizer, and you increase that by 50%. So in this case, instead of putting down 30 pounds per 1,000 square feet, you would put down 45 pounds per 1,000 square feet. It's fairly easy. And then there's other additional information on the soil report. And of course, if you have any questions, you call the extension office and we'll be able to help you figure it out. Next thing you want to do is, most Georgia soils require organic matter because of the heat and humidity. And so you're going to need to amend your soil to get a good soil structure, to get it good and soft, and it gets called friable, where it's kind of crumbling, and you need to add organic matter. And the rule of thumb in adding the compost is about 3 inches of organic matter per 12 inches of soil. And you want to put this in your garden about 1 month before planting. If your compost isn't, if your organic matter isn't fully composted, it's better to overwinter if at all possible. And then you want to work the organic matter deeply into the soil. You want 6 inches minimum. That's the root zone to allow the roots to go down and easily get through the root system. And 12 inches is greater. The deeper you can go, the better your soil is going to be for a longer period of time. Some of your sources for organic matter is decomposed manure, wood chips, sawdust, wheat straw, pine straw, leaves and yard waste, and they're all good for composting your garden. What you don't want is any dog or cat feces in there. You know, we pick up our stuff in the backyard and throw it out there. You don't want to be having this in your garden because you're going to be working in it with your hands, so you don't want to do that. And we also talk about it being fully decomposed or composted, and especially your manures and animal waste. But why do we want it decomposed? Basically, if you can know what it is, it's not fully composted. So we have here a shovel full of organic matter, which is your soil conditioner. You can look at that, and that tells you that that is a soil conditioner. On the right-hand side is compost. You can't really tell what that is. You don't know if that came from soil conditioner or manure, yard waste or whatever. So this is what's called compost, and this is, we talk about organic matter. Now, why do we want it to be composted? Well, if it's not fully decomposed, it's going to use nitrogen to complete the decomposition process. And what that does is it steals nitrogen away from the plants, and it's going to impact the productivity of your vegetables. Now, having said all that, adding partially decomposed organic matter to your soil isn't harmful to the soil. It's just going to impact your productivity this year. But next year, you're going to have more compost in your garden. It's going to be a lot better off next year. You want to watch your vegetables throughout the year, and then you may need to add a little bit of extra nitrogen if it seems like the vegetables aren't growing quite what you expected. Now, there is one thing about putting in is your animal manure, as green or partially decomposed animal manure is dangerous to put on all gardens, but especially to put it on your vegetable gardens. It may have animal pathogens in the manure because it is an animal waste, similar to putting a garden over a septic field. So you want to make sure that if you're using manure, that it's fully composted before you put it in your garden or use it as a fertilizer. Soil conditioner, that's an excellent amendment for the soil. That's my preference. I use that quite a bit in my personal garden and even in the garden here at the extension office. And it's a very good soil. You till it in at the end of the season. That way next year it's composted and ready to go. And most of your garden centers carry this in bags. And soil conditioner is really nothing more than pine bark fines, real small pieces of pine bark that have been crumbled up and they decompose very quickly. It's kind of like pine straw. It rots, very, very quickly. Peat moss, that's a good amendment to your soil. It tends to be costly, and it's also high in acid. And most people recommend that you mix it with other organic amendments. You don't want to use just pure peat moss. And last is your cover crops like crimson clover, rye, and wheat. You plant this at the end of the growing season, and then in the spring, about 1 to 2 months before you're planning to plant your vegetables, you till this into the ground, and it'll be ready to go. What we have is here is the pictures of various types of gardens. You have the raised bed garden here in the top left corner. This is what our vegetable garden used to look like before it was replaced with a road. Here the garden. You have straw bales. These are great for kids to show them how to grow tomatoes or cucumbers or whatever. And then you have container gardens. Now we have here is small container gardens, but you can also use watering troughs used to feed your cattle or anything. Even a bathtub can be a container gardening. And there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages to each method of gardening, and what gardening concept you choose Depends on your space, your mobility, your budget, and other factors. You aren't restricted to one gardening type. Many times you might want to even incorporate multiple types of gardening in your gardening project. It gives you more flexibility. You can become more creative, and it may increase the production of your vegetables. First thing we want to look at is maybe the standard garden, and that would be an in-ground garden. And in-ground gardens use the existing soil as its soil base. You can see here, all we did here is put some timbers around to define the base of the garden, and then we amended it and brought in some additional soil periodically over, probably 12 or 15 years to get the garden looking like this. One of the first things you want to do is, before you even till the soil or add a soil to the ground, is remove the sod. I'm from the north, so I didn't have anything to do with Bermuda grass, and I found out how Bermuda grass is very, very aggressive. So you want to get rid of that Bermuda grass beforehand. If not, you're going to have a problem with Bermuda grass for years to come. And some of the advantages of our in-ground garden: one, it's usually less upfront cost. It's usually cheaper because you're using your existing soil, and the additional cost of adding soil is usually minimal. And it's also, they tend to be larger, and that gives you more planting options. Some of the disadvantages is, if you have a large garden, a tiller is almost necessary to spade a large garden over and over. Even we had 1,000 square foot, and tilling or spading it was very, very difficult and very time consuming. Your terrain may limit the location, size, and layout of your garden. Example would be a fairly sloping ground. It could create some significant erosion issues, which would make a in-ground garden impractical. And you can have some heavy shade that impacts portion of the garden throughout the day, also making it impractical to plant certain areas of that garden. And it's not ergonomically friendly. And by this, I mean, it's hard to maintain the garden if you have problems with your knees or back or your hip where you're getting up and down. So it's not real ergonomically friendly. So that brings us to the raised bed garden. And a raised bed garden is defined as a garden that's at least 12 inches high and has all of its soil added. And we can see here, we probably have about a 22, 24 inch garden here, probably around a 20-inch garden. And you may or may not, depending on this, you might be able to get away with not removing the sod, but it's a good idea to remove the sod. If you don't remove the sod before putting the garden soil down, you at least want to put cardboard down to keep the Bermuda grass from working its way up through there. I don't recommend using black plastic underneath your garden bed. That could create a damming effect. Weed cloth is okay to put down, but you probably want to have at least 12 inches of soil over that weed cloth, because you get into it and digging with a shovel or even a strong tiller, you might start pulling up that weed cloth, and that's going to create an aggravation that you really don't need. Most of the common building materials for raised bed gardens is landscape timbers, treated 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x8s. And also you can use concrete blocks, bricks, corrugated roofing on a frame to build your beds. There's a lot of different options for a raised bed gardening. The advantages of it didn't really think about this, but snails and slugs and weeds have a hard time getting into your raised beds because they can't crawl up the sides of the raised beds. And if it's high enough, you can also keep the rabbits out of the bed without putting up fencing. It gives you better drainage because the water moves more easily through the improved soil that you normally add to raised beds. And then also some of the water will seep out through the walls of your raised bed. Sometimes it's more adaptable to unfriendly garden terrain. You can build raised beds in a terracing fashion on the slope of the ground, or you can put a raised bed in those parts of the garden area where you have full sun, and you can have different designs. You can have triangles, circles, things of that nature, and it makes it more adaptable to unfriendly terrain. Big advantage of raised bed gardens is it's a better ergonomic height. You don't have to bend over as much, and to perform your garden tasks. And if you want to, as we saw in the picture, you can just rest on the walls when you're doing the gardening. And it's also easier to hoop garden. And hoop garden is basically we take PVC piping and you just hoop it over your garden bed and fasten it down. And I got these pictures from the Green Meadows Preserve over in Dallas Highway. Most of you have probably seen that. Okay, if you look at this hoop garden, I don't know if you can see these little black dots right here. And if you look down here in this corner, if you look real closely, you might be able to see some webbing on there. And it looks like it may have been some sort of a bird netting, but it's probably used to keep the rabbits out of the garden. And the other thing you can do with hoop gardening is you can cover it with plastic. I believe this is plastic, and that would help this time of year. It's going to help with frost protection and freeze protection for your plants in the summer. And then in the winter rather, and in the summer, you can remove the plastic and you can put a cloth over there that's like an insect and bird repellent protective cloth that keeps birds and insects from getting into your vegetables. And it'd be great for things like squash bugs, which is really hard to control. Some of the disadvantages of raised bed gardens is it's pretty costly to build and fill up with soil. Our 8x8 garden that we put in last year, it costs a little bit over $400 to build and put the soil in. And we need to add a little bit more soil to it right now. So it's pretty costly, to build. They last about 5 to 10 years on average from what I read online, but I think the 5 years is probably if you're using untreated lumber. I think if you used landscape timbers, you could probably get easily 10 years. Of course, if you use concrete blocks and bricks, it's going to last a lot longer. And one of the disadvantages is the soil in raised beds tend to dry out more quickly in the summer heat. That's kind of one of the negatives of the positive. It gets better drainage, but because it gets better drainage, it does tend to dry out in the summer. So in Georgia, we have the luxury of being able to plant our garden pretty much almost year round, but we can primarily, it's in spring, summer, and fall, we can plant our garden. And they've divided the vegetables into 3 different categories. And these categories are determined when is the earliest date you can start planting the vegetables and when is the latest date you should plant the vegetables. And the first grouping are your spring vegetables. And you can plant the spring vegetables from February through March. So if you want to get in February, you have tomorrow. Then you're into the March category. Okay. And what they do is these vegetables grow well in your colder weather. They can handle the frosts and some freezes, but they do need to have protection in a hard frost or multiple freezes like we've had here a couple of weeks ago. Just got some vegetables at a store, and the tender vegetables, a lot of them were frozen pretty hard. So even though they can handle it, they couldn't handle the freeze. And most of these vegetables, they will mature before the summer heat arrives. And a lot of these vegetables, when it starts to get warm, they tend to bolt and they want to produce seeds to reproduce. Then you have your summer vegetables. The summer vegetables are divided into 2 groups. First is your early group and your late group. And you can plant your early summer vegetables around March 15th. And then the summer vegetables, late summer vegetables, you start planting them around April the 1st, which is coming from Pennsylvania. That is really early to be planting summer vegetables. One thing you have to keep in mind is the late frost. The last frost in the spring is around April the 10th. So when you plant your spring and summer vegetables this early, you want to check the weather forecast and check out on frost protection when necessary. You have your fall vegetables, and I've divided this group into 3 categories. That's your early, your late, and your real late vegetables. you can plant them start planting your fall vegetables in July, August, and September, keeping in mind that the first frost is usually right around November 1st. So again, especially with your early fall vegetables and your second crop of summer vegetables, you want to pay attention to the frost. So you may have to provide protection for that. So you all are probably asking a question, okay, what if vegetables fall into these categories? Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because UGA has this handy dandy vegetable planting chart, okay? And the planting dates I just talked about are divided into spring and fall. If we look at this, hopefully y'all can see this. So I can bush beans. It tells you more than just a planting date. But you go across this planting chart, it takes 50 to 60 days for it to mature. Then it gives you the cultivars that the extension office service has found to be really good. These are the cultivars like Bronco and Blue Lake are good bush beans here for Georgia. Then it tells you March 15th to May 1st, you can do your spring planting, and then July 5th to August 10th of your fall. How many seeds or how many plants to put down per 100 linear feet, the spacing, and the plant depth. This is a really good source. And Mary Carol's probably putting this already in the chat box, but extension.uga circular 963 is where you get this, a real handy source for you. Next thing we want to talk about is types of planting and how do we plant. And there's companion planting, succession planting, storage planting, and rotation planting. And companion planting is basically putting vegetables together in order to maximize your space. And in raised bed gardening, I think we want to use every square inch we possibly can. So companion planting is a good way to do that. An example is kind of putting your fast growing plants with slower growing plants, and then your tall plants with short plants. And they don't really compete with each other. So what you're able to do is grow two crops at the same time, and they come to maturity at different times. We just did this in our extension office. And what we have here is this first circle. This is spinach, and that's left over from last fall. It made it through the winter, so it's still there. Then the yellow circle is green romaine lettuce. The red circle is really struggling red romaine lettuce. And over here, if you can see that this is a broccoli plant. And so the plan is that the lettuce and the spinach will be harvested before the broccoli takes over this area. So we'll see how this works this year. One thing about gardening is to see what works and what doesn't work. And in my years, I've seen a lot of stuff that doesn't work. So we'll see how this works. The next thing we want to talk about is succession planting or double cropping. And that's to extend your harvest or to increase your harvest. And there's a couple of examples. One example of succession planting is to plant a row of green beans, and then about 2 or 3 weeks later, plant another row of beans. When the harvest of the first row begins to dwindle, the second row starts to produce beans, so you'll have fresh beans for a longer period of time throughout the summer. Another option is plant larger crops back to back. And an example there would be to plant a crop of green beans. They are harvested, pull them out and plant a second crop in July, and you'll have another crop. And that's usually for the purposes of canning. We have kind of cheated on that. We have here the cabbage that we planted last year that it didn't do too well, and then it finally overwintered and is starting to grow right now. But then this week we planted 12 small cabbages. In about 45 days, these will be ready to go. These cabbage here should be picked probably another 2 weeks. We'll be able to pick this cabbage. And then about 45 days, these are small heads of cabbage. They'll get about 3 pounds. And so this is an example of succession planting. Okay. Then you have your storage planting. And basically, storage planting is planting all your crop at one time. So you can harvest or process your beans at one time, your corn at one time, your tomatoes at one time. So when you're doing it, you want to do everything at one time. It's just it's a little more efficient. That seems to be a common practice in your large in-ground gardens and up in the colder climates where you don't have as long a growing season. And then you have rotation planting. And rotation planting means that you don't plant the same crop back to back in the same spot year after year after year, and you move your vegetables around in the garden. And the purpose of this is you want to help try to reduce the buildup of pathogens and insects that cause damage to specific groups of vegetables. And we're not going to talk about those groups right now, but growing vegetables organically, and we'll have that link at the end, and also Mary Cal will be putting this in. It has a very good section in it on how to rotate your crops and to help reduce your problem with pathogens and insects in it. So when you lay out your garden and start planting your garden, the first thing you want to do is kind of draw out a map of where you want to put stuff in there. And then if not, you're just go out there and start planting. Next thing you know, you have an empty garden, or you have everything's filled up and you didn't plant everything you wanted to plant. So this is a very simple map. It's hand drawn. It doesn't have to be fancy. You could have a computer drawn map if you like doing that kind of stuff, but a simple hand drawn map, it works well. It should be kind of to scale, so you have able to visualize where everything is going to be planted. So what you want to do, the first thing you want to do is determine what vegetables do you want to plant. What are your priority plants? Do you want tomatoes? Do you want squash? Do you want green beans? What's really important for you? The next thing then is, how much do you want to plant? Do you want one tomato plant just to eat, out of the garden, or do you want 10 tomato plants in order to make some, store the plants later that year? So then once you figure that out, is how much space do they take? Your squash, your zucchini, cantaloupe, things of that nature take a lot of space, so you have to plan for that. So once you have all that planned out, then you make a map of where you want to put your cucumbers, your zucchini up here in the corner. You have all your, in this area, tells you it takes a lot of space. And then also next year, you save this map, and next year, instead of planting your zucchini and everything up in the top right-hand corner, you'll plant it down here where you planted your radishes, your carrots, and things of that nature. And that helps you to do your rotating your plants. Next thing I want to talk about is your fertilizer. Okay, and fertilizers are sold by a grade. What we have here is a 13, 13, 13. And these numbers refer to the percent of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash in the fertilizer. So if you had a 100-pound bag of fertilizer of 13, 13, 13, you will have 13 pounds of nitrogen, 13 pounds of phosphorus, and 13 pounds of soluble potash in there. Now totaling 39 pounds. So what's in the other 61 pounds? Well, that's other nutrients. You can have some of your micronutrients in that bag of fertilizer. You can have some fillers. Sometimes you'll have conditioners. Some fertilizers are designed to have slow release, so you have that kind of stuff in there. One thing about putting down fertilizer, it's always safer and better to use less fertilizer than too much fertilizer. Too much fertilizer may burn the roots, and also, especially nitrogen, it causes too much vegetative growth, which has a negative impact on fruit production. It's generally advised to work about 50% of your recommended fertilizer into the soil before planting your vegetables. And then you'll apply the remaining fertilizer in two separate applications of about 25% each. The last side dressing application should be made right before the fruit begins to form. So when you start seeing the vegetables produce their flowers, you want to make sure you've already had that last application of fertilizer. I have a picture here of how to side dress your fertilizer. You want to keep it about 3 to 6 inches away from the plant, and you want to work it in gently into the soil. You don't want to damage the roots. So you gently work the fertilizer into the soil. And also, if you get any fertilizer on the leaves, you want to remove the fertilizer from the leaves because it will cause burning later on. Okay. Especially in raised bed gardens, it's very easy to apply too much fertilizer. So if you don't weigh out the fertilizer or measure the amount specified in the soil test. So what you can do is you can invest in a cheap kitchen scale that you can use in the gardening. Then you can measure out exactly what you need for your garden space. Or you can use a pint jar. They found that a pint jar is about 1 pound of fertilizer. We have a picture here of a 1 cup measuring cup, and that's 8 ounces. So, and it is good for measuring out your fertilizer, and it's also makes a good scoop to use for your fertilizer as well. Okay, your watering. Your vegetable garden requires about 1 to 1.5 inches of moisture per week. And so you have a rain gauge here will give you an idea of how much rain you're getting or how much water you're getting from your sprinkler system. Another tool you can use is a soil moisture tester. And this is really handy if you have mulch your garden. You're able to stick the probe down into the soil and find out the relative moisture, and then that tells you whether or not you should add more water through the sprinkler system or through your drip irrigation system that you may be using in your garden. There's 2 basic types of watering system. One is a sprinkler system. We have a picture there of someone just using a sprinkler can to water the vegetables. And the sprinkler system is an easy way to water. It's what I think probably most people water your gardens. However, using a sprinkler irrigation system does have some drawbacks. You water your whole garden and not just the vegetables. So you're watering walkways and unplanted areas as well as watering your vegetables. So you're using more water than necessary to water your vegetables. Also, there's greater evaporation loss because especially with the overhead sprinkler, it evaporates as it's moving back and forth in the air, and then it lands on top of the vegetables and the top of the mulch and things of that nature, and it more readily evaporates, so you have evaporation loss. And probably one of the biggest disadvantages of the sprinkler system is it increases the chance of fungal diseases due to leaf wetting. Your funguses that attack your vegetables really like moist conditions. So when you keep your vegetables wet longer than normal, then you increase the chance of having a fungal disease. So if you're going to use a sprinkler system, you want to water the gardens in the evening, somewhere between late evening and early morning hours when you already have dew on the plants. So the plants are already wet, so it's okay to water during that period of time. What you don't want to do is increase the length that the vegetables are wet. What did I do? The next thing is the drip tape and soaker hoses. We have a picture down here at the bottom. Okay, and this is where we have the old soaker hoses. This is a very effective method of getting the water right next to we had corn here, so we're putting a soaker hose there, and that's watering the root zone of the corn rather than watering the walkways. And I'm trying to figure out how I can do that a little better right there. So, but it's a very effective way to get water to the plants. And the big advantage of this is it does not increase the chance of having fungal diseases. Now, there's 2 options for this system. One is a drip tape, and that has holes or emitters to apply the water, and it just puts water out intermittently throughout the length of the hose. And then you have the soaker hoses, which is what we were using. And there's two different types of soaker hoses. One is the round soaker hose is made out of recycled rubber. What I found with them is they tend to be brittle. They're good for about 1, maybe 2 seasons, and then they start breaking pretty quickly. And it's pretty costly to replace them. There's a new flat soaker hose is on the market. I don't know what it's made of. It's kind of like a nylon base, and it works around the garden pretty easy, and it's easy to store. You don't have to worry about it being broken. It lasts for several years without having any damage. And one thing you want to do if you're going to use the soaker system is put the soaker hoses down before you put the mulch down. One year I made the mistake of putting mulch down first and then put down the soaker hoses. And that was very, very time consuming getting the soaker hoses down next to the vegetables. Okay. With regard to watering, okay, you want to water the garden deep enough to maintain a moisture level as uniform as possible. Some vegetables don't grow well when it goes through periods of wet soil or moist soil and then dry soil. So you want to keep the soil moisture level as uniform as possible throughout the growing season. And don't water every day. A lot of us, sometimes we have a habit of watering too much or too often. And what that does is the water just stays on the top and it causes the roots to grow very shallow. So what you want to do is water once or twice a week. You want to water very deeply to get the roots to go down deeply. That way when they don't get any watering for a period of time, the roots are already down deep enough to capture the moisture that's down 3, 4, 5 inches into the soil. And like I say, you do want to keep that uniform throughout the growing season, but there are two critical times. And the first of these critical times is the 2 weeks after planting. And you want to make sure you get the water on them during this time period, one, to ensure that proper seed germination, and then also to get good root development during this critical time period. And the second time period that's critical is when you have blooms and fruiting begins. And this is when you want to ensure maximum moisture and nutrients are getting to the fruit so you can get a good production. Your non-fruit vegetables, it's like cabbage and lettuce and turnips, there's no special time for them. You just water them throughout the growing season. Whoop, what do I do here? Okay. Now let's talk about weed control. Hoeing, that's pretty much restricted to your in-ground gardens where you would have to hoe because you have more problems with the weeds in your in-ground gardens than in your raised bed gardens for the most part. And when you hoe, you don't want to hoe any more than you have to. Just hoe enough to keep the weeds under control. You also don't want to hoe very deeply. Basically, you just want to kind of scratch the weed off the top, keeping your hoeing down to about 1 inch. The deeper you go, what it does is it churns up the moist soil underneath and it dries out your soil. Also, there's a lot of weed seed in the top 2-3 inches of the soil. So you're just pulling weed seed to the top and the weeds keep growing. So don't weed very hard. Don't be very aggressive. You want to make sure, especially when you're hoeing around your vegetable plants, you don't damage the roots or the vegetable. The other thing is mulch, and it's good to keep, this is really good to keep the weeds in check. It adds organic matter to the soil at the end of the season when you till it into the soil. An added advantage is it holds moisture and it keeps the soil cool, and it also keeps the moisture from evaporating out of the soil. So it's an additional advantage. Good mulching materials are compost, wheat straw, your pine straw. You want to put about 2 to 3 inches of mulch down. You do want to be careful. I would kind of go with the 2 inches versus the 3 inches. When you have a light rain, the mulch tends to soak up the moisture. It acts like a sponge and it keeps it from going into the ground. So you can't put too much mulch down, and it does impact the availability of rainwater to it. And And then you just till that, like I say, till that in at the end of the season. Wood chips are very good mulch for controlling weeds. But one of the disadvantages of them, you have to be careful, is you really don't want to till them into the soil. It takes 2 to 3 years for the wood chips to rot. And if you're planting transplants like tomatoes and broccoli and things of that nature, wood chips aren't a real big problem to deal with. But if you're planting your seeds, wood chips get to be a problem. They cover up your seeds and it impacts the ability of the seeds to grow. And it just gets to be an aggravation. What you want to do is rake the wood chips off at the end of the season and then reuse those chips. And then gradually over a period of time, they'll rot and you won't have anything to rake up. Another option is your manufactured cloths, like white and black plastic. White plastic is used to keep the ground relatively cool. Black plastic, it has the advantage of not only keeping the weeds down, but it also warms up the soil. And it's good to put down in the spring and in the fall when you want the ground to be a little warmer in order to get the plants to grow a little better. Weed cloth is very good. I prefer weed cloth to plastic. The main advantage that I think weed cloth has is it allows the moisture to get into the soil. And where black plastic, the water tends to pool on top of the plastic. And weed cloth seems like it works better, at least the way I put it down. Also, it seems like weed cloth lasts a little longer than your black plastics do. A real nice process is using newspaper. You can put down 2 to 3 sheets of newspaper and then put wheat straw over top of it. One hint that I saw is to wet the paper before you put it down. And because when you put something lightweight down, there's always a breeze comes up and then you're chasing the paper all over your neighborhood. So wet it down, that causes it to stick. Okay, it should be a plant. Wheat straw is protective because after a while it's going to just deteriorate it just walking on it. Here's an example of putting down the newspaper and then covering it with wheat straw. This is what in our garden we had a couple of years ago. I personally prefer this system. And when a couple of years ago, I had some hip problems and I spent a lot of time on my hands and knees. And this makes it really clean to work in. It's a lot softer to work in. It did a real good job of keeping the weeds down. And at the end of the year, it was just real easy to till it into the soil. So we're coming to the end here is harvesting. This is what it's all about, is harvesting your own product. We have a picture here a couple of years ago. This is Robbie. He's a Cheatham, a master gardener, passed away. We had a bumper crop of collards one year. I don't know how many collards we had that year, but it was a lot. And we had 1,000 square foot garden, and we regularly produced over 1,000 pounds of produce almost every year that we donated to Helping Hands. And I believe if you have a similar sized garden in your backyard with planting, in the spring, summer, and fall, companion planting, succession planting, I think you can do, as well. Not even with a 500 square foot garden, you can produce a lot of produce. Okay, talked about these circulars. This is the second most important slide. And the vegetable gardening in almost everything I presented to you today comes from this section right here. Okay, it's vegetable gardening in Georgia. I stole a lot of the information from there. Okay, and it also contains the vegetable planting chart. Okay, something I didn't cover is the vegetable garden calendar. The vegetable garden calendar. And that's a calendar, 12 months. It tells you what to do each month with regard to vegetable gardening, a very handy tool. And then growing vegetables organically. If you're interested in organic gardening, this is a good bulletin to get. It covers rotation planting very well. It breaks down each of the vegetables into the rotation groups. Organic gardeners use this a lot in order to help reduce insect and disease problems in their garden. So the most important slide is what it's all about, growing your own tomatoes and lettuce for a tomato sandwich. And I thank you for listening. We went through this pretty quickly. Hopefully I answered some of your questions, and hopefully you have some more questions. Thank you again for listening. Okay. Do we have any?
All right. So somebody just asked the important question of, will all of these links that I've posted in the chat be available after this is over? Unfortunately, they won't. The chat disappears from the recording. But what I will do is I will email everyone. If you're on my registration list, you'll get an email and I'll send those links out into that email. I'll also send a survey. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and post a link to the survey in the chat so that if you'd like, you can go open it up right now and give us a little feedback about your participation today. So I'm going to send that to everybody right now. And I'm going to look at the questions and see what we can see. One question from Darlene is, what are some things that you can add to the bottom of the raised bed before adding the soil? You want to tell them what we did out here where we salvaged some old soil to put in the bottom part of the raised bed?
Am I on?
You can. You can unmute. You can mute, and I'll unmute.
We had some leftover soil. Actually, what it was some fescue sod that we had a big pile of that. So we used that to fill up our soil bed. There is I can't remember what it was called, but there's a process where you take old yard waste, branches, logs, old firewood, things of that nature, and put it in the bottom of your raised bed to reduce the amount of soil that you have to purchase. One thing you don't want to use is treated lumber. That will not rot over a period of time. I'm going to take that will, but it's going to take forever for it to rot. You can also put, if you want to, you can put concrete blocks, bricks, things of that nature in there to help reduce the amount of soil you have to purchase. I have heard of using plastic bottles, putting them in there. I'm not sure about that. That's something that yes and no. One thing is, once you decide to quit gardening, tear your garden down, you're going to have to deal with that. That's about the only thing I know. I think a good thing is, if your neighbors have old branches from trimming your shrubs and stuff like that, you can put that in. And then what happens is, as it rots over a period of years, kind of like construction debris in our home lawns we have right now, you just gradually add, several bags over a period of time to keep your soil level up.
Okay, so really quick. So another question that I answered in the chat was about using PVC for, somebody asked about using PVC for the irrigation system. And I answered it. You might have some other thoughts on this. I said that I thought that was fine. We used to use PVC as a framework for our soaker hoses in our vegetable garden here. The one thing that I thought of was that PVC may not wear as well outside as it does in our homes, or, because it's just exposed to the elements more. You got to kind of do some maintenance on it. Y'all would take it up in the winter. In fact, I think that PVC frame is still back at the back of the building, but.
What we did is we used it as a header, and then then we ran our soaker hoses off of it. And then, like you say, well, you just open it up in the wintertime. And we had ours laid in place. Now, you can also use the irrigation lines that you put down your irrigation system, a regular sprinkler system, and they worked well. I don't know how long the PVC that we have has been around at least 9 years because it was here when I started gardening, so it was here longer than that. So yeah, PVC it'd be very useful to doing that. You can make a good header system, and then it's also very easy. You just cut it and glue it and cut it and re-glue it. It's very adaptable. Yeah, I would recommend using that.
Another question that one of my co-hosts, Ashley Brantley, answered for us was one of our participants wanted to know if lettuce was suited to succession planting, and it is. Lettuce is actually great for succession planting because it's such a quick crop. And then one other question that we got was raised beds, will the soil heat up quicker than does the ground absorb and retain more heat than wood if you use concrete block or concrete raised gardens? And if yes, will that negatively impact the roots of plants? And Ashley answered, in case y'all haven't looked at the chat, and said raised beds just generally have soil that will heat up quicker than in-ground gardens. Doesn't even matter if it's wood or concrete based. And typically because of that, you can plant earlier this season because the soil is warmer. And the blocks are probably going to retain some heat, but not enough to damage the vegetable roots. And typically the roots aren't going to make a lot of contact with that concrete. So that's all the chat questions, unless anybody's entering anything now. So we really appreciate y'all coming. And I will reiterate, I will follow up with an email that includes the links that I shared in the chat, as well as a link to the webinar survey. Would love it if you went ahead and went to the link in the chat box now and took the survey real quick. Promise it's really quick, but it will help us as we develop programming in the future and help us to evaluate what we're doing and what we're going to do going forward. So we really appreciate y'all coming today and hope you have a great day. If you are a Master Gardener volunteer, let's take about a 5-minute break and come back, not to this Zoom meeting. We're going to log into the other Zoom link, the Master Gardener meeting Zoom link that Kristen sent out yesterday. So check your email for that link. And if you need us to resend it, give us a call in the next few minutes. Tina can probably help us with that. So y'all have a great day. Thanks again for coming. So